Hi, Rodger Baker. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. Ever since I had the opportunity to participate in one of your workshops a few years ago on geopolitics, I wanted to talk to you again. And there are a few burning questions about the state of the world, and I think you are super well equipped to provide a few useful answers for them. And as far as I know, you are one of the leading experts on analyzing the geographic influences on power relationships in international relations and international politics. First, maybe to kick off with a question, as it says already, geographic influence and power relationships are your subjects. But how far is your profession attempting to look into the future when it comes to your topic?
Right. So it all depends on who we're working with. I know that several years ago in our company, my former founder, we put together a book looking 100 years into the future. The idea, though, of that was not necessarily to say we can predict 100 years in the future with accuracy. It was to say, let's use that as a way to think about how these types of geographic, demographic, economic changes interact with each other and may reshape our expectations of the future, right? And so you can use it as a tool. As a predictive tool of patterns, I would say geopolitics works really well in the 5 to 10 year range.
Mhm.
And in that range, you're not erasing the acts of individuals, but you're stepping a little bit above the individual decision maker. You have a little bit more range of space and time that you're working in, and you can see those less personal factors play a stronger role over that longer time frame. The geopolitical analysis does really lousy in predicting what somebody's going to do tomorrow, but it does a really good job of understanding what happens when they make that choice and what are the implications.
Mhm. That's interesting. And in order to understand the world and our contemporary phenomena, is it useful to actually refer to certain terms? Because there are a few terms that I find very intriguing, but also in a certain way threatening, because I don't know what the implications might be for us as citizens. There's, for instance, asymmetric warfare, unrestricted warfare, unconventional warfare, hybrid and mosaic warfare. And that all sounds kind of crazy. What does that mean? How does that play out in geopolitics?
Right. I think one of the things that we get to is, of course, geopolitics is a synthetic field. So it tries to draw in from many other places. I would argue, at least in the applied geopolitics that I work in, it traces itself back to the British geographer Sir Halford Mackinder, and actually to a paper that he wrote long before he wrote his first big geopolitical concept on the heartland or the pivot of Asia. He was writing on trying to save geography as a field in and of itself.
Mhm.
The world had decided that geography was no longer necessary because everything had been discovered and mapped, so who cared? And he said geography is the one place in academia where, well, everybody specializes more and more. You need some place that ties it all back together and looks at it as a whole and collectively. When you talk about terms then like asymmetric warfare or hybrid warfare or things like that, they're specialized terms in specialized fields of study, right?
Mhm.
And they have very distinct meanings in those fields, but then the words move out into popular jargon and take on much fuzzier meanings, kind of
Mhm.
like the word geopolitics has. Um, and when we think about those frameworks in the context of geopolitical analysis, geopolitical intelligence, we do think about them. We may not always use those terminologies, though, right? So hybrid warfare is the idea of both what we would think of as traditional war, right, shooting people, and gray zone operations, another term to throw out there, things that are shy of shooting people. So when you see, for example, the Chinese maritime patrol vessels using water cannons against Philippine ships to discourage them from territorial claims in the South China Sea. It's not shooting them, but it is using a slightly less violent tactic to assert territoriality. And then within that also, though, can be things like information warfare, narrative warfare. And again, we're throwing out a bunch of jargony terms here, but basically it means how do you shape the perception of others, right? And if we really think, though, about even physical warfare throughout history, a large component of physical warfare has always been moral warfare, emotional warfare, informational warfare, trying to shape assessments, views, and opinions, because it's not just the ancient Chinese who consider the most successful war the one you never have to fight. You can use perceptions of power to change the political actions of others. And so when we think about hybrid warfare, it's going in there. When we think about asymmetric warfare, I mean, what's the word asymmetric? It means it's not similar on both sides of the equation. So how do people with lower technology fight people with higher technology? And we've seen that again throughout history. You can look at the Mujahideen fighting against the Soviets, or the Taliban fighting against the Americans, or Deborah and Barak fighting against Sisera, where they used slings and tricked the opponent into running their chariots into the mud, and then took out armor through light infantry, right? So these are concepts that have been utilized for a very long time. We put terminologies on them for those specialized studies to be able to better understand them. But certainly we know the world is uneven, right? The world is unequal, and you're going to have entities that have different levels of technology, different levels of societal cohesion, different levels of resources, and they're going to come and interact with each other. And it's very frequently asymmetric interactions.
And then in regard of what you just said, like the terms themselves become fuzzy, but can you still trace them back into what is going on with our society? Like let's say, as I said, like the asymmetric, unrestricted hybrid type of warfare that maybe also influences the type of polarization we are now witnessing in our societies with the divide and conquer type of attitude that disables us to cooperate and work together.
Well, I think there's a you can look at it in that way, and you can also look at the idea of different perceptions or modes of what is acceptable in international relations, and when those are not commonly agreed upon, you get confusion, and you get a return often to more nationalism, more not necessarily isolationism, but protectionism and things of that sort. So from the conceptually, and it's not perfect and it doesn't always follow this, but conceptually, the United States considers warfare one thing, economic activity one thing, and while they overlap with each other, obviously, and there are huge connections between them, they're considered separate spheres of activity, influence, and control. The Chinese, the Russians don't necessarily see it that way. So as the United States observes China doing things like using the same tools for industrial espionage as it does for state espionage, as it does for military espionage, and blending it all together and using these different things together, from the US, that's sort of a jarring concept, right? And that becomes a hybrid warfare, or this all-time war, or things like that. And then the US replies to it, not trying to find a way within the US framework of how it considers the separation of war and economic competition. And often that leads to a very loud political dynamic that says, oh, you let the Chinese steal everything. You have let the Chinese undermine everything. You've let them put spies all over the United States. And the response is greater than the pendulum swings too far, basically. And then that creates the backlash on the other side. And then you get political polarization, because people who have been under the mode of, oh, we need to collaborate to be able to maintain stability, are now seen as naive or dumb or out of date. They fight that. And then people who sit in the middle who say, we need to be logical about this, are seen as being on one of the extremes or the other. And you build that, and it takes a while for that pendulum to swing back. And it's not only an interstate competition or conflict, you can see that in changes in state norms, right? When the US went through the civil rights movement, it created huge frictions, and it took a long time to swing back, and it never fully swings back to a centralized pendulum. And you can see this in many countries, these types of extreme responses to major changes or to different patterns by countries that you're now engaging with when those countries suddenly become near peer or peer size countries.
You're now using this pendulum metaphor, and I like it very much. You also said something that risks have opportunity components. I heard you saying that. Apart from metaphorical analysis and maybe a SWOT analysis, what kind of tools are you playing around with your colleagues to make sense of the world?
Right. So, I mean, good analysis requires you to do a combination of qualitative and quantitative work, right? The big, broad frameworks, to a great degree, are qualitative frameworks. You're not going to collect enough information to build a true, effective quantitative model of the world. The more information you collect, the more gaps you have, the more you have to collect, right? If you're familiar with the Foundation series by Asimov, Harry Seldon manages to pull enough data on all of society that he's able to create his little magic box that can tell the future out and things like that. That I think is the dream of AI and big data, but you will never have sufficient information to be able to actually map that out. So on the broad side, we use traditional geopolitical analysis. We use what we call the 7 pillars of geopolitics, right? And there's no magic numbers or anything like that, but it's geography, thinking about geography not only in its present, but in the way it has influenced the evolution of societies in the past. It is politics, economic security, the 3 that most people think about and talk about. Society, which is, in my view, very different than politics. Society, history, and technology. And we look at the interaction of all of those and think about how they interplay with each other, right? Technology changes the relative value of geography because it can change the perception of distance, or it can change the type of resources that are highly competitive. And therefore, certain geographies can completely be the most important point in the world for 100 years, and then for the next 100 years, nobody cares. Or the other way around, right? As we're going through a global energy transition, we anticipate a change in relative value of geography internationally, right? As the resources that are being pursued are different resources, and certain areas become highly competitive, or areas that are highly desired because of the change in resources. So we look at it that way. Then from the bottom up, there are all sorts of traditional tools out of intelligence analysis, right? Out of state and private intelligence analysis. So you can go through and use the things that will help you work on assessing your own biases and making sure that you're aware of your biases and your assumptions that you make as you go into it. There are lots of tools that you can use to pull and map data, and really be able to start looking at it and manipulating data to find patterns that lay within it, or to find data, use the data to test and challenge the theories that you're putting forward in that qualitative space, to find what constrains it or what creates the ability and the opportunity for those things to go forward. And then we do a lot of work in formal and informal scenario building. Looking at identifying what are the key drivers of a particular pattern. What happens if we change one? What happens if one is stronger or weaker than another? How do those start to change in these interweaving futures that we're looking at? And then can we identify indicators that will help us see ahead of time which one of those 3 or 4 plausible future patterns we are more likely moving toward, and which ones we are starting to have a greater difficulty of achieving, which will then shift the way we're looking at the way the future evolves, which sounds really complicated, and it sort of is, but it's not as complicated as it sounds.
Yeah, I once participated at a geopolitical table. I'm not going to say now in detail what it was, but my impression was that still people at the end of the day just use what they have read the last 2 weeks in the news. We seem to be prone to fall into that kind of trap. How do you overcome those kind of patterns that in order to come up with something unexpected, surprising, a little bit more diving into categories of the unknowns, surprises, yeah, all that what seems to be, first of all, a little bit more alien and unexpected.
Yeah, so that's what's behind me. One of the things I think that's really important if you're going to do strong geopolitical analysis is don't just be aware of the present. You really have to think about the past. You have to think about the frames and things of that sort. You have to think about changes and things. So if I'm reassessing something, I always start with geography. I erase my base knowledge. I re-look at the place, try to understand how the place has influenced and shaped the society that has evolved in that place, right? You think about the Great Wall of China. Well, where does the Great Wall of China sit? The Great Wall of China sits at the intersection of two substantially different climactic zones. One is the big flat steppes, right? What did the big flat steppes in old days lead to as a mode of economy? Herding, right? That is what they are for. South of the wall are river valleys. What do river valleys lead to in economies? Sedentary farming, right? So you have a migratory herding entity and a sedentary farming entity right next to each other. Well, what happens? Those modes, conceptually, we would say, well, in humanities terms, they would trade with each other in equal terms. But in reality, it's not usually that case. When there's a stress in the nomadic entity, they sweep down in and steal from the sedentary entity. And so you build the Great Wall. Well, it's interesting then as you think about China on its river valleys, and you look at the way in which they have created giant buffer space around them over historical time, where their borders go out to, but don't really go much further. Their borders kind of expand and contract to about the same space over and over again in history. So trying to understand what is it about that space that creates the limit of the expansion of Chinese power, but also the limit maybe of the need for the expansion of Chinese power. And then how did that develop the Chinese worldview of where they sit and how they interact? And then we can come and look and trying to think about in the future how changes in relative economic power or geographic power around it may change things, and how does China's now dependency on international trade, which it never had in the past, change the way that China perceives its space. But also read a lot of history, right? Read a lot of different, and history, as we know, there is no such thing as accurate history. History is always more a reflection of today as it perceives the past than it is of the past as the past perceives itself.
I like to say history is a fiction of the factual.
Yeah, but the interesting thing about history is if you can go through and look at different moments of the historical analysis of the same past, you can actually start learning about the evolution through those times of the way in which people see, perceive, understand, and you get different ways of looking at that. I'm a big fan of adding in things like cultural literature, the literature of the states that we're trying to study, music, and science fiction. So how do you get those ideas? Good quality science fiction helps you think about things in really interesting and different ways. So right, the Foundation series, for all of its craziness, at its core is this idea of big data, that if you collect enough data, you will be able to accurately predict the future, right? Which is the dream of everybody today. But when was it written? You know, this is not something that was written in the middle of the AI revolution. This was written long before it. The Red Mars series, when we really start thinking about what are some of the potential complications as we look at the occupation of the lunar surface, right? And then we can, and the Red Mars series does a really good job of thinking back to, let's look at Antarctica and the way a empty space is shared or not shared amongst nations. So we can start to see ways to look through some of these different spaces, and get different ideas and different ways to think about it. And then the final piece is try to work with people who are very different than you. If we're really drilling into something new, or some new concept or idea, or really trying to understand change or something like that, we always try to put together somebody who's got a geographic knowledge base, somebody who has a thematic knowledge base, so you can cross them over, and maybe a third person who's bright but doesn't really know a lot about either of those, and who can ask the dumb questions. But those dumb questions are often the really important questions, because they help those of us who, if you spend a lot of time looking at something, all sorts of assumptions solidify in your mind, and you don't think about why did you make those assumptions. They just sort of build and build and build. And sometimes you need the outsider to come in and say, well, why do you believe that? Why do you make that assertion? And you have to go back and force you to tweak and break. You don't want to do that every day, because then nothing ever gets accomplished, but you need to do that periodically, to get out of that rut and to come up with new thoughts and new ideas. And it's useful too, if you think about it, like somebody who does a lot of work on Latin America may say, when I see stimulus X, it usually results in output Y. But a person who's working in the Middle East, or a person who's working in East Asia, might say, well, when I see input X, it usually results in output Q. And have you thought about in Latin America that it doesn't always have to be Y? Sometimes it might be, and that gets you to go back and look and say, in this situation, context is different. Maybe the outcome is going to be different, where over the past, the pattern has been the same, the same, the same. Context is tweaked. Now I need to start thinking in very new patterns, rather than rely on the old patterns that I'm used to.
No, that's fascinating. And regarding the asking the dumb questions, I mean, that's why we are here in a certain way. So I need to also ask you, how do you deal with, so to say, the cognitive dissonance that you might experience when you expose yourself to completely counterintuitive types of thinking, and where you also feel maybe a cultural backlash or something like that? How do you handle that, and how do you weave that into your methodology again?
Oh, I handle it very poorly, and I get angry and storm out of the room. No, the entire life of an analyst is cognitive dissonance. It is contradiction, and you have to put yourself into that mindset. So, for example, an analyst has to hold on to their assessment in the face of withering criticism, but also be the first to change it if they find that the evidence is wrong, right? So you can't be wishy-washy and flowing with the daily tides, but you also can't be so rigid that you don't recognize error. You have to both take that deep knowledge that you have developed over time and apply it, and be willing to throw it all away and look at the new and look at the change. So it's always, you're always living in this back and forth. I look at the big picture, and then I look at the really narrow simultaneously. I look at the long time frame and the short time frame, right? The longue durée, and the now, the immediate. You're recognizing those cultural differences in perception. So I have a concept I've been working on, which is, when we think about tactical geopolitics, which is what most people are wanting today, right? Well, geopolitics is what the president is going to do next week. I think that's way below it, but when we think in that more tactical realm, that we're looking at, I think you have to look at things in two ways. You look at objective geopolitics, of which there is nothing truly objective, and you look at perceptive geopolitics. And the difference, what I mean is that perceptive geopolitics, unlike in realist theory, geopolitical theory doesn't assume that everybody sees things in a particular similar way. It recognizes that the individual has evolved and developed in a particular set of circumstances over time that have shaped their perception. And when Putin comes out and says Ukraine is a necessary component of Russia and Russian security and Russian history, and the Western retort is, well, that's a dumb reading of history, you don't know what you're talking about. That's a useless retort, because to Putin, that is accurate, right? And therefore, if that is the perception that he has, the decisions he make will be made off of that perception, not off of some Western retort that claims that his perception is inaccurate. So you have to understand the perception of those actors. What is their perception of the geopolitical framework that they're going to make their decisions? The impact and outcome, however, is not from their perceptive desire. It's from the objective assessment, that top-down, outside-in look. And so when you look at the two of those together, the choices that the individual is likely to make will come from understanding their perceptive view of geopolitics, context, constraints, compulsions. The success or failure or impact comes not from that, but it comes from the objective view, and rarely do the perceptive and objective views align perfectly, right? And that's why we see over and over again, if they aligned perfectly, why would we consistently have leaders who do not accomplish their goals? Yeah, right? They don't align. Reality is different. Desire drives certain things. Expectations drive certain things. But, you know, raw, boring reality constrains or compounds the impact of those desired paths. So that's one of the things that we have to do. And that comes into that idea then of remembering that understanding the motivations and perceptions of the other is not the same thing as advocating. And if you really look at most analysis, if you explain why Putin is doing something, then you are accused of justifying his behavior. If you explain why Kim Jong-un tests a certain type of rocket, you are accused of justifying behavior. Therefore, the only legitimate analysis is to say, this is crazy and irrational. Well, if you say everything is crazy and irrational, you will never make an effective policy or an effective understanding. And so you have to separate that idea of understanding and advocacy. And then accept the fact that everybody's going to yell at you and call you an advocate. And if you do your job right, you'll be equally criticized by the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Mm. Yeah, the attempt to understand has been has not been in favor of current politics, and also the mindset with this type of hyperbolic certainty that is flowing around. China and Russia, they sealed a no-limit pact. What can we learn from that, and what does it mean for us? And should we also think of forming new alliances outside of what we currently think is available?
So one, it's really interesting to look at the history or the way in which China makes these arrangements or deals, right? China has a strategic partnership with Poland. They have they have a strategic partnership now with Georgia. They have strategic partnerships all over the world. What do they mean? I think that China is very, very aware almost of the way Washington warned the United States on his way out of being president, right? Don't get involved in entangling alliances in Europe. China does not establish alliances in the Western or in the traditional view. And that is, China does not create a relationship that requires it to intervene on behest of another. Instead, it tries to create these partnership relationships that, for the most part, are useful when things are good and maybe give some cushion when things aren't great, but does not force the Chinese into a particular course of action. And if you look internationally, traditional alliances are favored less and less. Rather, alignments and smaller types of arrangements are becoming more and more favored. So think about the complexity in NATO, right? And NATO expansion, and should Ukraine be a part of NATO or not be a part of NATO? And what's the basic argument, right? If we oversimplify it, the two basic arguments are, if Ukraine is in NATO, Russia is less likely to attack Ukraine. Well, why? Because then Russia would be attacking all of NATO and you'd go into global war because NATO would be compelled to intervene. The alternate view is Ukraine should not be in NATO because if Russia attacks Ukraine, then NATO is it's the same thing, right? The alliance structure itself, the compulsion component of an alliance structure, on the one hand, conceptually is a strong deterrent, right? Russia didn't invade Poland, they invaded Ukraine. They haven't invaded in physical military sense, the Baltic states. They did invade Ukraine. They did invade Georgia, right? So on the one hand, those alliance structures are a very strong deterrent. On the other hand, once that deterrence is overcome, they compel action. And many states these days are less and less interested in being compelled to action by the actions of another state. And that's where I think those traditional alliances in their complexity are breaking down. The other piece of that then is that traditional alliances are often holistic. It is, you have to be aligned politically, economically, and security-wise all at once. Well, we know that over the last 30 years, the global economy has become more diffuse and less concentrated on the North Atlantic, right? Therefore, there's a push against the idea that one must follow Western liberal ideals, and there's a push against the idea that one must have 100% political alignment, economic alignment, and security alignment to be partners. Instead, there's a lot more flexibility and fluidity that seems to be emerging. And as we talk about the concept of multipolar world, that seems to be the norm. So instead, you'll have very small targeted things like AUKUS, right? AUKUS is very much military and technology focused. It's very small. It's a very tight group. If it expands big, it will lose effectiveness. If it stays small, focused, and tight on a small number of issues and a small thing, it will work. Or you have these new frameworks, IPEF, right? Super fuzzy. You can join the pieces you want. You don't have to join the pieces you don't want. It's about influence rather than about forcing and trying to lock people into particular spaces. Whether good or bad, it seems to be the path we're going. And you can really see this question play out in the debate over, will the US be affirming or non-affirming over Taiwan? Right.
So in consideration of the potential of climate-infused conflicts in the near-term and far-term future, so will we ever experience a global community working for peace and sustainability? I don't know what the role of the UN nowadays is, but I'm just wondering if we can develop those kind of pragmatic means for a common utopian ideal. Or what is standing in the way? Is it in the end really this authoritarianism of dark triad characteristics, or is that too much of a black and white point of view?
I mean, I'll say that what stands in the way is individual selfishness, which is the nature of humanity, right? And for good or bad, and whether you want to put that to the origin stories through a deity or the origin stories through evolution, either way, family first, me first, family first, community first, nation first, then the world. That's the natural pattern of things, right? And therefore, it's very difficult to create that true, the world first and then country and then community and then me, family and then me. It's difficult to do that unless you're very high on Maslow's pyramid and you're super comfortable. Well, as Mackinder said, there is in nature no such thing as equality of opportunity for the nations. The world is unfair geographically. And that geographic unfairness continues to influence our senses of safety, security, comfort. And that is what I would argue ultimately pushes against the idea that you can overcome all of that and have that utopia. It's not outside of the realm of possibility for humans to suddenly change their mind and do that. We know that societies and groups can do amazing things like that. But I would argue that it is not within the current plausible realm. And it's interesting, again, going back to science fiction, whether we look in books or whether we look in movies, what is the only thing that ever brings the world together? An outside power, an alien power, right? That finally says, oh, wait, we all have to be one thing because now there's another that's completely another, right? It doesn't matter that everything else. So that, it's a terribly sad, depressing answer.
Yeah, you could have assumed that a virus might have been the same effect, that it could have aligned the entire world, but it was more or less the opposite.
Yeah, yeah. So it to me, I don't see it going in that way. It doesn't mean that humanity can't continue to make progress in certain aspects of collaboration, but I think that in the end, it all comes back to the needs are very different in different places, and the solutions are often attempting to be universal. And universal solutions do not apply to a very, very complex and uneven world.
Yeah, universal solutions. And still, we have a few terms, even if they are fuzzy. But how does or how do the words polycrisis, pyrocene, ecocide, omnicide already infiltrate and penetrate the field of geopolitics? And do those kind of narratives, or even new narratives in any form and direction, help to shift perspectives and mindsets? I mean, we are somehow seemingly stuck in a growth economy. I think we all know that. We have often around us reductionist frameworks and a type of antediluvian industrial age engineering type of management mindset. So in that regard, monochrome understanding of complexity and ecology. So how do we get out of this type of disaster by design? Is there a path forward that looks a little bit different than what we are all seemingly witnessing currently?
I mean, again, I think there are technologies that, as we continue to evolve technologies, they ease certain burdens. Every time you ease a burden, you create a new problem, and that may be a reality. So those are there. And then when we get into some of those terminologies like ecocide and things like that, I think those become terms that are used for political purposes rather than explanatory purposes. And their value then is more in that political space than in that geopolitical space. We try to understand them, but we see them as tools of attack almost more than they are tools of understanding. And that's with a lot of the terminology that we see thrown around most of the time.
I see. Well, I think our time is up almost. So thank you very much. I would love to do that again as soon as possible if there's an opportunity to do that. There's